density would be less, while the smaller piece of wood, hold on, wait.
If you need to illustrate that or like write it down, you can.
Yeah. Would you like me to reword the question or re-say it? No, okay. I got it. Hold on. Would you rephrase it, please? Of course. Would a larger piece of wood have more or less the same density as a smaller piece of wood from the same tree? Okay, so a larger piece of wood would have a larger volume, more surface area, and have a lesser density because the smaller piece of wood would be more compact and its volume would be smaller, and so its density would be heavier. It'd be more dense.
Okay, and just a follow-up question on that. Let's say that you're using that same piece of wood. If you were to drill a hole all the way through it, do you think the density would change? And how so?
The density would change because you're taking the entire volume of it and then you're disrupting it. It's not going to be like a continuous volume anymore. You're making a little hole. So like if you were to calculate or whatever, you'd have to take out that portion.
Mm-hmm.
So the density would be less because density.
I am a robot. Okay, and what if it were partially open? If it didn't go all the way through?
So it would affect it similarly as the other one had, but not like as extremely. So if the other one had like decreased the density a lot, this one would decrease it by a slightly less amount because it's still taking out an area, like still taking out a piece of that volume, but it's not taking out all of it.
No, you're good. Do you think you could illustrate it maybe?
Wonderful. So I said if we have like a normal piece of wood, right, the density would just be like your constant. You drill it all the way through, the density would be less than that because of the volumes changing. But if you drill it halfway, the density would be less than the normal, but more than the all the way through. So like if you were to go in order, it would be normal, halfway, all the way through.
Okay.
So, quick question pertaining to that. So, will the wood still float, or would the whole or the partial whole like make it sink or not?
I think it would depend on how dense it was prior and how the mass affects it, but it should still be able to float, probably.
And could you tell me, do you know of any other factors that affects an object ability to float or affects that object's density besides the mass, the volume?
Particularly in a liquid.
In a liquid. So like its ability to float or sink in a liquid. Um, I guess like maybe the type of liquid. Like if you take into account like how oil and water interact and like the difference between that. So I guess pertaining to the density of the liquid itself compared to the object.
And could you elaborate on that? What's the difference between oil and water? Like, how do they interact with each other?
So
Like for example, why we shake salad dressing.
because like their densities don't really like to mix together. And like with the salad dressing example, the denser objects or like the little like sediments or whatever at the in the dressing sink to the bottom. So when you mix it up together, it reincorporates together because the lesser density is remained on top, the denser stuff's on bottom. But because they are still in a similar enough environment that they will interact with like oil and water don't like to mix as well because of how much their densities differ.
Okay, and on adding on to that, do you think that another solid like salt can affect the density of water? So I guess it's kind of like the salad dressing is just a little bit more homogeneous than the other one, but let's just take for example that we had a saline solution. It's just water and salt. Do you think it would be a different density than it was before?
I think the density would differ because we're adding an external object into the solution. So it wouldn't just be the regular density anymore. It'll now be an incorporation of the density of what the water was and what the salt was. Because it is homogeneous, they would mix together and it wouldn't just be two separate layers. You would have to take into account both together.
Okay. And to follow up on that, do you think you could name me two examples of items that would have the same mass but different densities?
So like the wood example earlier.
Yeah. So same mass but different densities.
Right. And then I guess you can take into account like maybe the boats also we can mention that how like they can have the same mass but like bigger boats have a bigger volume and so their density would differ from a smaller boat who has a smaller volume but the same mass.
Would they both float, or would they sink?
They would both float depending on how their density interacts with the density of the water.
Okay, and let's say if you was on a boat and was sinking, and you saw a big piece of wood and a smaller piece, which one would you choose to save yourself?
Uh,
You want us to ask this again or like rephrase it?
You can rephrase it. I mean, I understand. I'm just thinking about it, you know?
Okay.
No problem. Take your time.
Just making sure.
Um, the smaller piece, I guess, because
And could you elaborate on why you like chose the smaller one?
um, because although the volume is less, so you have like less surface area to grab onto, the density would be no. I picked a larger piece. My bad.
And could you
Yeah, because the density would be less in the larger piece because the volume is larger, so it's more likely to float, and you wouldn't sink as much as if you were to pick the smaller piece where the volume is less, and then you would sink.
that's what made you change your mind because of the volume difference?
Yeah, I went and
Okay.
looked at the picture that I doodled earlier and thought about like the difference between the densities and like.
But let me explain this. So did you think about you adding your weight to the wood mass? 'Cause remember, you have to get on the wood. So would that make a difference in your answer choice?
I did think about that because you would be increasing the mass. It wouldn't just be the mass of the wood, it'd be your mass with the wood's mass. So that would affect the density of the object. So I feel like I guess I'll choose the bigger piece.
Okay.
Well, I think that's everything we have for you today, correct?
Yes, so
Thank you so much.